Welcome to Security Disruptors, an ongoing series of live panels focused on pressing security issues. The security landscape is complex. It involves growing threats to global, economic, political, and national securities. These threats include economic coercion, electoral interference, lawfare, espionage, cyber attacks, money laundering, illicit finance, transnational crime, terrorism, kinetic war, space war, and misinformation. The security landscape is vast and the threats keep growing and evolving. The old ways of addressing these interconnected threats are no longer sufficient. Our aim on Security Disruptors is to break down barriers and bring leaders together to foster integrated solutions. Today, we're focused on Arctic security. Tensions are rising, highlighted by following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The old perception was high Arctic, low tension, which led to low attention. Not anymore. Today, attention to the Arctic is rising. Our panel today is Alex Delisle of the Montreal Institute of Global Security, Sean Moon, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, retired, and Mads Fredriksson of the Arctic Economic Council, along with Calvin Krusty of Critical Risk Team. Now, one last thing just before we get started. If you want to ask a question of the panel, go to slido.com using the password security and send in your question. Now, just before we start with the panel, I also want to acknowledge the support of our sponsors, Mines, through the Department of Canadian and National Defence, and Project Econ. Sean, I'd like to start with you. Quite simply, are we already at war in the Arctic?
If you look at the U.S. Army's conflict continuum, it starts with peace and it goes to kinetic warfare. So are we at war? We're in a state of open conflict, would be a better way to say it. It's not kinetic yet, but it is certainly in an operational preparation of the environment phase. So to answer the question succinctly, war? No. Conflict? Absolutely.
And so how does that express itself? When somebody says, well, I don't see a kinetic war, what's the threat? What is the conflict? And from your perspective, what do we need to be aware of that it's not, that we can contain it?
The current conflict is hybrid. It's gray space warfare. It is our competitors or opposition or whatever phrase you want to use, working in the interstitial seams between our authorities, our organizational structures, all of the things that provide an opening or an opportunity to leverage our weaknesses against us with the intent of achieving state objectives of our opponents. So, for example, look at the attempts both, I'll just say across North America, of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, to gain control over resources, critical minerals, energy, what have you. So it's a hybrid warfare that's just short of open conflict.
Mads, you see this hybrid intrusion into northern Norway quite frequently. How does this express itself? What's been happening?
I mean, just to follow exactly what Sean said, it's not all peace in the Arctic, but it's also not all war in the Arctic. Let me do a quick tour traveling down the coast of the Arctic Norway. So we go on the border to Russia in Kirkenes, where there are flight jammings happening constantly. So domestic, commercial airplanes are getting jammed there. They cannot use their GPS for landings. The same goes for the fishermen there. They can no longer rely on their GPS because of jamming. We can go further down the coast. We had discussions in northern Norway where to put wind turbines because we want our radars to be able to track any planes flying in. So actually, we are moving where we are placing our wind turbines so we can track whatever planes are coming in flying low. We can go even further down the coast to University of Tromsø, where we have had two spy incidents, people that said they came from Brazil and suddenly turned out that they were nationals of a different country. And then we can go even further down the coast where hydropower plants has been hacked. They try to turn off or actually turn on the volume of water coming out of the hydropower plants. And then a few subsea fiber optic cables being cut. And this is not in the past 10 years. This is in the past 2 years. And I represent the business sector, and companies are feeling this every day. What we heard about hacking happening all the time. Like who we thought we could trust, we can no longer trust anymore.
When it comes to the severing of fiber optic cables, though, that is more than just hybrid. That is an active, an assault on infrastructure.
Depends if, yeah, it is an assault on infrastructure. The problem is you cannot prove it. There's a lot of accidents. We have seen the same out in the Baltic Sea as well, with ships accidentally going across subsea fiber optic cables with their anchors. And then I also want to mention there's another one which is kind of showing the border as well. It's just in today's news in Denmark. Just 3 hours ago, the Danish government seized a LNG tanker as a part of the Shadow Fleet. We have seen the US government have done this for a while now, and France have talked about doing it, Netherlands as well, the UK. But these are the Shadow Fleet as well suddenly being seized. So it's definitely getting more hot.
Alex, from your perspective, what sort of activities are we seeing in the Canadian Arctic that would suggest that there is a growing conflict, not open armed conflict, but that the tensions continue to rise?
Well, I think, a lot of the discussion, you can break it down in a couple of ways. Certainly you can look at conventional military threats, which include strategic, nuclear, et cetera. There's a lot of continuity over time in the Arctic being relevant to protecting North America through the various air lanes, Great Circle routes coming from adversaries like Russia and China on those questions, North Korea, et cetera. The addition of hypersonic weapons, other innovations, has raised that profile, and therefore things like NORAD modernization are very, very important. I mean, the other part is around, I think, the economic security question. We've seen Chinese mining companies either try to own outright, other firms trying to buy infrastructure. Now with a more sophisticated approach, having been blocked in many cases, trying to take ownership shares in the companies that do own mines, et cetera. So we do have a series of economic security threats, and as you opened the part, political interference, of course, has to be seen as a concern that affects the totality of the of Canada.
So you mentioned Chinese efforts to own mining companies in Canada. When we take a look at what is the real richness of the Arctic from a minerals perspective, Alex, I'll come back to you. What kind of opportunity exists there that is of such interest to the Chinese in particular, but to anybody else who is looking to mine critical minerals? And then, Mats, I'll come to you on the same topic.
Well, I think you need to take a step back and look at supply chains and strategic sectors, particularly relating to defense technology, to computer hardware, to parts of the energy transition in terms of renewables. There's many things that are mined that China currently dominates either the mining of or the processing of. So they have a very strong position. I think the picture in the Arctic actually varies quite a bit by region. Certainly in the North American Arctic, for Canada, Greenland, Alaska, there's many upfront challenges that have very little to do with security. I mean, just have to do with cost, lack of infrastructure, et cetera. And I think in the Canadian case, it is sometimes a bit of a myth that it's actually the Arctic that is the key to Canada's natural resource wealth and geoeconomic position. In fact, if you look at it, the northern provinces, the southern territories, other places are the primary locations. That said, we've seen, in Baffin Island, there's a major iron ore mine, that has created a lot of shipping there, et cetera. And I think it's fair to say in an era where the Canadian government is looking at large infrastructure projects, trying to get regional initiatives and investments that have socioeconomic impacts, the potential for mining is being looked at very hard throughout the territories.
Matt?
Yeah, and to answer your question, I just want to zoom out for 10 seconds. Just say there are, but only 4 million people lives there. And I think that's an important context when we talk about these economic opportunities, because it is, very big mineral resource exporting industries that are there. So is seafood is a massive export, energy, oil and gas, from the North Slope in Alaska, but also from Russia, and then minerals. So is fish, is energy, and is minerals. When it comes to minerals, none of the processing is happening in the Arctic. So that's an important caveat. Yes, the minerals are there, but some of them are difficult to get. And the most valuable right now is obviously the gold. When anyone looks at the gold prices. Having said that, I do think it's interesting, for example, to see that Department of War, Department DoD, is investing in a graphite mine in Alaska. That's quite a new thing. Why is the Department of War suddenly investing in graphite mining in Alaska? Because we need to have our own minerals. It's the same for Greenland. Currently, there's only one active mine in Greenland. There is potential for more, but it's going to cost a lot of money. So you're not going to do it for commercial reasons. You're going to do it to get independent from getting the minerals from elsewhere. And then you got other places like Sweden. So in the Arctic part of Sweden, you got iron mine and rare earth elements as well, which is a lot more accessible. And then finally, the Russian Arctic, which is also an important context, which is 50% of the Arctic is Russia. And they have a lot of minerals as well. And they are currently selling a lot of these minerals, for example, nickel. So it depends where you look in the Arctic. Overall, it's more expensive to do mining in the Arctic because of infrastructure, because of lack of processing. But sometimes this might be worth the added cost. We also have the Red Dog mine in Alaska as well, which is providing a lot of money to the community as well as being critical for national security. Just one small anecdote for 1 second. That was a few years ago when the US government had to stop producing F-35 fighter jets because they discovered that some of the minerals came from China. So imagine, and this, we're not talking about 1%, it was less than 1% of the minerals, but if China wanted, they could have blocked all production of the F-35 fighter jets just by blocking that mineral. So there is a need in the Arctic, but it's going to take a long time. It takes 17 years to open a mine if you start from scratch.
Well, I think that you also pointed to the fact that there's limited infrastructure. So you also introduced the concept of China being very active in seeking out these minerals. And of course, so much of the processing does happen in China. Sean, from your perspective, how important is it that we pay attention to the role of China in the critical minerals sector in the Arctic?
Simply put, it's absolutely critical. It's difficult to exploit those materials. We need to recognize that. It's expensive. That's why, the North Slope of Alaska, they pulled out of the ocean drilling process. And there's nobody up there because it's so bloody hard. But at some point, those materials are going to be necessary. I'd like to step back for a moment and talk about the ownership subject that came up, though. One of the things that is a hybrid tactic is the use of ownership stepped back multiple times. There's a mine or a proposed mine in Alaska that's run by an Alaskan limited liability corporation, which is in turn run by a limited liability corporation in Canada, which is in turn run by another LLC in Las Vegas, Nevada, which is in turn run and operated by 2-3 steps back, the People's Liberation Army. So ownership determination is extremely complex. That's one of the gaps and seams that is being exploited. It's tough to get this stuff, but if you can control it, you own the valve on those materials. And China has been exquisite in getting control of rare earths and materials. It's an F-35 takes at least minimum 35 pounds of rare earths.
Being controlled and processed in China. Calvin, the way in which the PRC has been able to infiltrate our systems has been a big concern of yours, not just for the Arctic, but in general.
Yeah, I think we've seen that, across Canada, across our allies. And I think I'd just like to flag, CSIS, the Canadian Intelligence Service, who's obviously bases their assessments in terms of the interconnectivity of information sharing with all our allies within NATO, the Five Eyes, and that came out last week and identified, while Russia is a well-known threat in the Arctic, it is without a doubt from a Canadian intelligence perspective that China is far more serious. And just like Sean and Alex and Mads had alluded to, they're operating in the crevices, and the big stakeholders in this aren't just going to be, the defense and defense contractors. It's going to be venture capitalists. It's going to be the mining sector. It's going to be, in some ways, the defense contractors, because there's also reports coming out that the defense contractors and the defense systems are now being subject of attacks in terms of hybrid attacks, trying to infiltrate them. In terms of insider threats, i.e. espionage. So I think everybody's looking at these threats, and I think Sean used, I can't remember what his terminology is, but they're going to be operating in the cracks and crevices. And I think really what's really important is, the education and the awareness for the local communities to be aware of that, because it's not something that the government's going to be able to do itself without the participation of the communities and industry and civil society, in essence.
So we're on the 4-year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And since then, we have seen Russian activity in the Arctic increase. How important has been the contribution from the Chinese to ensure that the Russian government and the Russian military can undertake their activities up along that border? Alex?
I think it's been essential. I mean, with the end of the rapid deterioration of the Russian access to the natural gas markets in Europe, they've really had to find someone else to buy their natural gas and their oil. And I mean, particularly for natural gas, all their infrastructure was set up that way. I mean, China is an investor in some of the liquefied natural gas projects that exist in Russia. Certainly has been one of the major purchasers at discounted rates in many cases, particularly with oil. So, I mean, that has been an absolute lifeline for the revenue streams for Russia. More broadly, of course, I mean, China has been integral to maintaining Russia's ability to wage this war and survive the economic ramifications that have come from Europe and the United States and Canada and our allies and partners. So, I mean, China has played a very large role. I think China has really exploited this. Russia, was initially very reluctant to have, back in a decade plus ago, to have China join the Arctic Council, for instance. So there's been something of, I think, a quid pro quo here in that, Russia is certainly allowing China to do more in the Arctic, enabling that to do more in the Arctic. So there's some very real, I think, implications for both countries that the Arctic plays a key role in for both.
So Matt, Norway and of course Canada, we in a way not the same as Norway, share territory that's faced off against Russia. How has Norwegian strategy changed as far as protecting the far north of Norway since the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, it has changed a lot. So just for context, the largest nuclear arsenal in all of Russia is located around 160 kilometers away from the Norwegian border. Obviously, these nuclear missiles is not pointing towards Oslo, not in any way. They are pointing a little bit further away. But there has been discussion recently in the news that, and this goes for Finland and Sweden as well, that Russia might have an interest in taking not the whole territory of the Nordics, but part of the territory, just to have a buffer for their nuclear arsenal. So how is that changing strategy? So during the Cold War, there was a public strategy in Norway saying that the military will retract back to where it was the easiest place to defend the country, which was where it was more narrow. There was a natural mountain range as well. But that would also mean giving up a lot of the country. Since the war in Ukraine and since the Norwegian government have seen how civil society is being treated, or the civilians are being treated in Ukraine, the decision is now we are not going to give 1 inch. Because it's simply like during the Second World War, when Germany had invaded Norway, they burned most of the Arctic part of Norway, like all the houses and everything. And that's they don't want to repeat that. And now Norway is, first of all, doing massive investments in the Arctic security. We see 2 out of 3 new brigades will be located in the north. NATO will have their new fighter jets control in northern Norway as well. And then Norway is also increasingly looking to how Finland is doing total defense, working with the private sector on defending the country, because it's just you have to work together right now. And I think Ukraine has been another good example of the role of the private sector in defending the homeland.
So, Sean, of course, Alaska is just across the Adriatic Sea from Russia as well. Are we seeing similar shifts in attention to securing the Alaskan coastline?
I'll have to give a nuanced answer to that. The answer is yes and no. What we're seeing are shifts such as President Trump's directive that more icebreakers be constructed, but we're not necessarily addressing the actual risk or threat. So, for instance, if the issue is hybrid threats, but we invest in HIMARS missile systems that don't work up there, all we're doing is pouring money into the wrong thing. Is there more awareness? Yes. The awareness of the strategic risk environment is rising, but it's not necessarily the correct narrative. There was discussion of public sector, private sector cooperation. That's going to be critical.
How then, Sean, do we protect against the very real issue that you pointed out, ownership of those private sector companies, so that we can ensure the integrity of that private investment?
Therein lies one of the gaps and seams that's being exploited. It's the private sector only has to cooperate as much as they want. The public sector is only going to focus on the things that they need, and the authorities are scattered. If we're talking about national defense, our DoD or DOW has authorities for its own security. It has its, warfighting authorities, but the law enforcement detection of things like who owns what and how far back is the actual control, those don't belong to DoD. Those belong to, say, DHS or the Department of Commerce, or, so these are seams where they're exploiting where we're not looking.
Calvin, if we take a look at the Canadian example, is there what are our opportunities to guard against this?
Fantastic question, and a concerning one, because I think, generally speaking, we're just learning what the threats are right now and where the vulnerabilities are, and then trying to find out where the risks are. And because of the population gaps and a number of social economic challenges in those communities, I think it creates an extremely vulnerable space for threat actors to operate. And I think Alex, being a fellow Canadian, would share my concerns for those communities. And I think, as Sean alluded to, that's the cracks and crevices, is going to be, do those communities have the tools and the support? And when you listen to the narrative, when you listen to, say, for example, our national capital talk about defense spending in terms of submarines and jets and that, what's absent in that conversation is that economic security conversation about what tools, what capabilities, what support are the people getting up there. Now, I have seen recent headlines where intelligence agencies are looking at moving up there, education and awareness. I'm going up there next week. Matt's talking up there next week as well in the Yukon for an Arctic Security Conference. But there's a lot of tools and capabilities that the communities need, in terms of machine learning, AI, relative to doing research, in terms of as Sean put out, who's behind that company and who's connected to that director of that company, to go, hey, who's really behind these foreign investments? And with the infrastructure or the legal structure within Canada, between lawyers and venture capitalist firms, it's going to be, there's going to be some dark spaces and gaps there that it's going to be very tough for the communities, even with the greatest degree of due diligence and well-intention, to be able to defend and protect themselves. So, when people talk about guardrails, we hear that term for the last couple of weeks in terms of strategic partnerships with China. I don't know if we have the guardrails to protect the communities, in terms of what we're talking about in terms of economic security right now.
So there's a question that has come in. Are we seeing land deals, purchase or long-term lease between Indigenous groups and foreign actors? Is this on the radar? Calvin, I'll come back to you, and then Alex and Sean, I'll get you to respond to that as well.
Well, I can say in terms of other parts of Canada, 100%. And I'll say, with humility, I'm just trying to learn this space, and it's my second trip up to the Arctic to work with the communities up there and have these conversations. To look at it. So I can't say with certainty in terms of, with definition in terms of what's happening there, but I can read between the lines, in terms of the Canadian Intelligence Service last week said it's in the economic security space, and that would be inclusive of investment in lands and in terms of critical infrastructure and mining and that. So just taking the headlines and the announcements yesterday or last week in Canada, I would presume they're seeing that.
Alex, from your perspective.
I think this, whether it's happening, it's certainly been blocked in the past, using Canadian legislative tools, but it's going to happen, or at least be attempted at some point, right? So there's a whole set of tools here, as we've talked about, from ownership, right up to land holding. I mean, China's in a much more difficult position to do any of this in the current moment because there's so much skepticism amongst all the Arctic democracies about China, its intentions, and the effects it's having on their security. So, I think that's been a real shift. I would add to what Cal says, is that, we're really thinking in the Canadian context, or we have to be thinking more about not just what the federal level can bring, but it's whole of governments, and I'd make that plural, because the territorial governments and then the Indigenous governments under treaty rights, have a lot of say in this. They also have a lot of awareness in this. So, I like to argue that, in fact, doing good security in the Arctic, is a lot of benefits that Southern Canadians get from having, Indigenous peoples involved in security, et cetera. I'll also add, on the land ownership piece, this is one of the most sensitive issues for many, Indigenous governments, and Crown federal relations in Canada. So in one sense, there's going to be a lot of caution coming from the grassroots level towards foreign ownership. And that could be any foreign ownership, any country. So I think, there are some resources we have in terms of, if we think of whole of society, if we think all of the levels of government working together, that we can actually use to maximize, national security, not just Arctic security.
Sean, the same applies in Alaska.
Absolutely. To answer the original question, we are absolutely seeing attempts to work with the Chinese attempts to work with the Indigenous communities to gain control of resources. For the most part, those have been blocked historically, but our adversaries have been doing operational preparation of the environment for a very long time. The Hearts and Minds campaigns with the Indigenous communities, we're your friend. We just want to pump money into and make your life better. But nobody's often looking at, okay, what's the end result of an investment into a mine? What are the secondary and tertiary impacts of us, or Canada, the US, whomever, losing control of a resource?
Calvin?
I was just going to touch on what Sean talked about, hearts and minds. I think that's, we talk about economic security, but the information security and political security is equally important. And I know next week, we're going up to the Arctic, and I was just talking with a colleague of Alex and mine, Marcus Kolba, who's going up there talking about the information narrative for the communities up there, and we were discussing how it interconnects with the economic and political security issues. So I think that's something that has to be part of the calculus. In addition to the submarines, icebreakers, and everything else, these other aspects have to be looked at if we're trying to build resilience within the Arctic, and not only within Canada, but as Sean alluded, to the U.S. and I would suggest to the Scandinavian countries.
So, Mads, you pointed out that there are fewer than 4 million people who live in all of the Arctic. How on earth do we create a security environment when we're not seeing population growth? As a matter of fact, we're seeing population decline.
Yeah, and actually it's related to the previous conversation we just had. And I would like to add a bit of complexity into this, because there has been an infrastructure deficit in the north for many years. I mean, just look at the digital divide, like the cost of high-speed internet in the north of Canada versus the south, or the road systems and so on. Nunavut is 100% diesel-operated fly-in fuels in a lot of communities. And just imagine, and this goes for Greenland as well, there has been an infrastructure deficit for many years in North Norway. And then imagine that China comes and says, we have a good deal for you. We're going to give you whatever infrastructure. We're going to invest in that deep sea port that your own government did not invest in. And this is the challenge. You go into a small community that has not felt that DC or Ottawa or Oslo or Copenhagen has invested in their communities for many years, and suddenly they get a very good deal. And this is not unique for the Arctic. We've seen that globally around the world, that suddenly a government comes in and says, we're going to provide you with a better deal. The challenge here is also that the same governments in the capitals are at the same time going to China for trade fairs and wants to do, the US still wants to sell goods in China, today, so go to San Francisco, they're going to try to sell their products in China. So this is the challenge, is that we are trying to ring fence the Arctic. We're trying to say, oh no, the Arctic is different. And it is because of the population and, the vulnerabilities. But we also have to admit that for many years, we kind of ignored investing in the infrastructure in the north. And I think that's one way. So in Greenland, for example, they never had investment screenings before. So like in the legislation, there was never an investment screening in Greenland. It's a country of 56,000 people. They never considered that they should do investment screenings because, who would come and invest that would be a threat for them? Now they're introducing investment screenings because the threat situation has changed a lot. So now they're actually looking into, who is it that's suddenly so keen at building a hotel, a deep sea port, data centers, hydropower plant. Now they're doing the screening. But how do you do it in a country of 56,000 people? That's a challenge. So we need to, share capability, share skills. We need to be better aware. And this comes with some training. I'm not sure a lot of people in the lower 48 understands Alaska very well, and the context of Alaska. So there is some learnings to happen, outside of the Arctic, because we need to assist in some of these investment screenings. We had a case in Northern Norway where Chinese private entity wanted to invest in the port of Kirkenes on the border to Russia, and that was blocked by Oslo. But there was very little communication between the local community and Oslo about why this investment was blocked. So we need dialogue with the local communities. We need to use the knowledge they have from boots on the ground, the eyes and the ears. But at the same time, we need to use like the massive power that, the capitals or the lower 48 or whatever you want to call it has. And then we need to, and I know Sean may disagree with this, but I do think right now is a wake-up call to invest more in the north, and to actually invest more in infrastructure, to invest more in some of these critical places that in mining, in energy, in deep sea ports, not only for security, but also just to win the hearts and mind of the local communities that haven't felt very supported for many years.
Sean, care to respond?
Answer that.
Knew you were going to throw that back at me. No, the lower 48 don't understand Alaska. And part of that is because the narrative that's coming out of Alaska is significantly different than the reality. There's the image of the rugged outdoorsman, strong and independent. Well, the reality is 29% of Alaska's budget comes from the lower 48. It is the most dependent state in the US. I mean, we're talking per capita, almost $9,000 per person is flowing north. I don't dispute we need to invest in infrastructure up there. We need energy. We need lots of things, but we need to invest in the right stuff. We need to be absolutely data driven, recognize what the real threats are, and that we just can't pour money in and expect it to do the right thing.
So, I don't know if you saw the Munich Security Conference panel on Arctic security last week. Clearly, interest is rising. They had put the panel into a room that would normally accommodate a smaller audience, and it was standing room only audience in there. The level of interest has increased, and of course, at the center of all of this is Greenland. The discussion around Greenland, Mads, as you pointed out, it's only 56,000 people. It is vulnerable, and the President of the United States, Donald Trump, clearly highlighted this by bringing up his issues. How, since the discussion from President Trump that they were going to take Greenland, we have started to mobilize. Is our focus increasing to the point where we might start to make those kinds of investments and move in the right direction to put in that infrastructure, attract investment, and protect those high Arctic territories that are so vital to Europe and North America?
I mean, I can go ahead and just say there's a lot of investments moving into Greenland as we speak, a lot, and this is thanks to the U.S. in many ways. A lot of these investments are moving up, and it's not only within hard security. It's also, as I mentioned, is landing strips. So new airports in northeast part of Greenland, is new deep sea port. In south of Greenland is a subsea fiber optic cable, so a spare one. Right now they only have two. A lot of these things are under the defense package. Then the Arctic Command is expanding their headquarters, so it's also infrastructure like this. We do see, and this is not only happening in Greenland. Right now, there's a lot of focus on Greenland, but we also do see massive investments in northern Finland, northern Sweden, in northern Norway as well. And I think it is about time that we realize that Russia is very capable of operating in the Arctic. I mean, 50% of the Arctic is in Russia. They are very trained operating there. We might not have been as prepared as operating in an Arctic environment. I will let Alex speak for Canada if Canada has been prepared, but definitely the Kingdom of Denmark, it's been a wake-up call the past year, but it has also followed with massive investments.
Alex, Matt's question, are we prepared? And in conjunction with that, Minister Nita Anand was on that panel and said, Canada is turning attention to Greenland as well by putting in a consul general there. Are we now starting to move in a manner that helps to ensure that we are going to be protecting our northern territories?
Well, I think that's certainly not a straightforward question in the sense that I think we are making some of the right strategic. There's been a sea change in how we've talked about the Arctic, how we've talked about defense and security in general since 2024 with the new defense policy and with our new Arctic foreign policy. We're still really missing that national security policy on a national level, which should have the Arctic as a centerpiece and speak to a lot of what we've been talking about here in terms of the hybrid threats. We've built some capabilities that are almost, unique in some respects. The Harry DeWolf class of ship that the Canadian Navy operates. The Canadian Coast Guard will be getting a couple of these. These can actually spend more time in more icy waters, more of the year. But the legacy of, I would say, you can pick your amount of decades, 1, 2, 4, 6, of neglect of the Canadian military and its capabilities has, made it, Canada is not as ready as we should be. And we haven't done as good a job, I think, of showcasing what we offer both to our citizens in terms of national security, but also to the international community in ensuring this part of the world remains stable, and that the status quo of at least keep it at confrontation and not war, try to de-escalate that. So I don't think we're ready. I mean, I do think that the trends for this, across the region certainly predate, even the current round of Greenland language coming out of the White House. Finland and Sweden joining NATO, I actually would say, is probably the most consequential change that in part led to Canada adopting the northern flank perspective, really talking about NATO as part of the contribution to North American Arctic security. That was a position Canada did not want to endorse until fairly recently. So I think we are seeing quite a bit of change, but we need to accelerate investments in the systems. And I think, as Cal and others have been pointing to here, we need to invest in the resources and governance to make sure we can build national security in our territory in the north.
Sean, did President Trump get what he wanted with his increased attention around Greenland? Because we're not hearing him talk about Greenland any longer.
I can't speak for the government in any form of official capacity, but I will note that, as you said, we're not hearing about it much. And what we got was a reaffirmation of the ability to build defense infrastructure. And there's a follow-on to that. If you build defense infrastructure, you have to increase the civilian infrastructure that supports the defense infrastructure. Most military bases are not these independent little cells that do everything that they need to do without any interaction with the local community. It simply doesn't work that way. There's a strong tie. So say you rebuild a runway and you increase the number of fighter jets, I'm just pulling stuff out of the air, you increase the number of fighter jets at that facility, well, there's a whole infrastructure that's going to surround the base that provides food and energy and what have you. So investment in the DoD stuff, which is what President Trump got, is also going to increase the infrastructure surrounding. We also need to be aware that decisions are made on perceptions. So who owns the narrative controls what decisions are made. The mention of MSC, the Munich Security Conference, brings something to my mind, which is that the U.S. representative on that panel was Senator Lisa Murkowski. Senator Murkowski is a strong proponent of pouring money into Alaska. Doesn't matter where the money goes, as long as it comes in.
Not necessarily directed at security.
Or at what needs to happen.
So I'm sure that you're all aware of Prime Minister Carney's address at Davos a few weeks ago, where he said that the old world order has changed and that collectively we need to be functioning in a different manner. Do you see greater cooperation, particularly within the Arctic Council? Mats, I'll start with you, and then Alex, I see you nodding and wanting to jump in on this topic as well.
No, so I will just start with the Arctic Council, and for the non-Arctic governance geeks out there, the Arctic Council is obviously the 8 Arctic states and the 6 permanent participants, the indigenous representatives, and then there are 30 plus observer states where China, India, France, Germany, etc. are some of the observer states. The Arctic Council has been on a pause for a long time on a high-level meetings. They're still meeting virtually in working groups, but I would not say it's alive and well, it's limping along. Right now it's the Kingdom of Denmark that's the chairmanship, and then it will be Sweden, and then followed by Canada. And I would say right now it seems difficult to see any greater development in the Arctic Council. Having said that, I do see greater collaboration in some of the Nordic Arctic states, for example. You see prime ministers. We also saw all the Nordic ministers of foreign affairs coming to Canada, going to Nunavut. That's quite historic that suddenly all the Nordic ministers of foreign affairs are coming to Nunavut. And they are not doing that just to see the beautiful nature there. They go there because of national security. So there is definitely greater collaboration. What we have also seen is a new trend, which I think also relates to this collaboration, is we see both in Canada with the recent defense strategy, but the same in Denmark for almost a year ago, that the prime ministers are going out to say, we don't care about, traditional procurement rules anymore. Just buy, buy whatever equipment is needed, because we need to ramp out our defense systems. And we've seen that across the Nordics, and especially on Arctic defense, that right now we need to invest a lot more and buy all the equipment we need. And that's also collaboration as well here, because we are too small to. There's been some criticism from the US of the European Union that it's too small, that each country has their own rifles and their own ammunitions and so on, that they need to think bigger scale. And there we also need collaboration to start thinking bigger scales, for example, in ammunition.
Yeah. Alec?
I'd say, in terms of going back to the Carney's speech in Davos, there's lots of debating of the finer points of what he had to say, and the use of certain rhetorical parts of that. Without denying the real turbulence that exists in the Canada-US relationship, it's also worth pointing out that in terms of cooperation, you can point to any number of things where cooperation continues, in consistent and in some cases intensified ways. Look at Op Latitude, which is Canadian Coast Guard and Navy with the U.S. Navy in the North Pacific. While all this discussion around Greenland was going on, NORAD was doing an exercise, Noble Defender, with Canadian and even Danish aircraft involved. We have the cold response exercises for NATO in the North. Americans are very, very participant in that. So we do see, a lot of, I think, functional and operational level cooperation. So, without denying, I think that the sum of the part for Canada here is, how are we, better taking care of our national security, and how are we being a better ally to the United States and to our NATO allies and partners? And some of that is, I think, a larger dose of independent thinking about this, and taking leadership on some of these issues, and that will generate at times friction with the United States, but that's happened many times in our history, and I think we'll be better for having those independent capabilities and bringing them to the table with the deep interest we have in collective security and cooperation. So I think we have to juggle a few different considerations when we think about the Arctic. I would just finish on the note, A7, so the Arctic 7 countries that are democracies, there's only 8 full-on Arctic countries, the one which isn't a democracy. Cooperation amongst these 7 is very, very crucial across all this range of issues that we've talked about. We all learn from each other, we all have distinct capabilities, we all have distinct resources, and we have a lot of creative ways of approaching this that, if looked at comparatively, I think can do a lot to strengthen our collective security across the 7 countries.
Sean, would you agree that the cooperation between Canadians and Americans in defense of the Arctic really appears to be unchanged, despite what the Prime Minister may have said in Davos?
Yes, actually. When I was a Coast Guard officer, one of the things that I observed was there might be a lot of maneuvering at the headquarters level, but when you get down to the field level, everybody cooperates because they have a common set of goals. To talk about the Arctic Council, though, you need to remember it was never designed and is not supposed to address defense or security issues. So that's not its role. It just simply doesn't have that jurisdiction. When we look at cooperation, US, Canada, yeah, we're still cooperating. There's a lot of noise in the channels and the news, but bottom line is, those are 2 countries. We are 2 countries that have a very long history of being incredibly interconnected. And there's just no way to change that.
There is no way to change it, is there, Callan?
I don't think so. I mean, no longer part of government, but years government. I, as a Canadian, realize the heavily dependent nature of Canadian security on U.S. relationships, as well as our European allies, Five Eye allies, and that. And I think my insights, including recent discussions just this week and last week, I was down in San Diego last week, Phoenix the week before, where Sean was at the tables that I was at. And I think at the political level as X, and we have to take into context, there's some big financial trade negotiations coming up. So There may be some saber rattling there, but I think there's extremely strong, if not stronger than ever before, realization at the practitioner and at the operational and tactical level of our nations, inclusive of NATO, that the only way forward in terms of survival, in terms of democracy, sovereignty, economic prosperity, is to keep those other things going at the operational and tactical level. Otherwise, our adversaries, who are masters of conquer and divide, will succeed in their mission.
Well, that's interesting. And there's an interesting question that's come in from one of our viewers talking about introducing public-private partnerships. If we're worried about just purely private sector investment, could public-private partnerships help guard against that? Alec, I'll go to you first and then come to you, Mats.
Public-private partnership is absolutely essential. And I mean, I think the slight difference of balance here is that, given, as Mads was saying, I mean, some of these investments have, political consequences that are far more significant in the context of the Arctic with its sparse population, great area, especially speaking of Canada, that, I mean, sometimes the investment, incentives aren't there for the private sector to do it alone. So, I mean, this is where, again, I think, taking advantage in the Canadian case, the fact that, you have a network of modern treaties, you have, established governments at the territorial and Indigenous level to actually hone these things, to make them useful, et cetera. I think you find, it's not my exact area of expertise, but you find quite a bit of, business. Maybe go to Sean's point, there's a lot of civilian involved in operating a military base. And I think we've seen a steady increase in that presence of the private sector.
Yeah. Matt?
I'll give you two quick examples. One is a Alaskan company, Far North Fiber, Far North Digital. They want to put a subsea fiber optic cable from Korea or Japan going across Alaska, Canada, down the coast of Greenland into Europe. So this is a private project. It's a subsea fiber optic cable. It also has the benefits that it provides high-speed internet to local communities. Okay, so some public entities would have interest in that, or providing high-speed internet by fiber to Pisofik airspace, space station in Greenland. And also, you can also make this cable a smart cable, so you can listen for whatever ships is sailing over the cables or under the waters. So this here, there will be a public and a private interest in putting in these subsea fiber optic cables in the Arctic that are currently not there. Another one, and is not as strong PPP as the other one, but it's a good example to the previous conversation about collaboration. There is one bipartisan topic in the US that both President Biden and President Trump have supported, and that's the Ice Pact, building icebreakers. And right now, because Sean mentioned his work in the Coast Guard, right now there's a Canadian company, Davy Shipyard, who is building, and they have Helsinki Shipyard that build 50% of all icebreakers. So there's a Canadian point here, then there's a Finnish point, and they also own a shipyard in Texas. So that's the US point here. So you got a Canadian company building the icebreakers or the icebreaking capable vessels that the Coast Guard is going to use. And this is happening right now. And this is something that has been talked about for many years. Now is finally happening. And I think it's quite a good example of collaboration between Finland, Canada, and the US.
So we're about to wrap up here. And I'd like to ask each of you, what would you like to see as steps in the next 1 to 3 years that help to ensure that we continue to move in the right direction to ensure Arctic security? Kelvin, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll work our way around the panel.
Thanks. I think for myself, and next week's going to be a super interesting week as I go up north to have some conversations with some of the Indigenous population. And we talked in the pre-planning in terms of the importance of bringing the Indigenous populations into the conversations, and not just in terms of the kinetic aspect and the defense aspect, but in that economic security aspect of it. And I think there's talk, and I would say that we're beginning to crawl in that space. We're definitely not at walking, and we're nowhere near running. And I would just like to see the economic security issues and those specific communities, not just having the conversations, but giving them the tools and the support substantively from the private sector, not just the government, going back on Ronald Reagan's 9 most dangerous words, hey, we're the government, we're here to help you. I think it has to be a private corporation relationship with those communities to help support them in terms of building their resilience against these threats.
Sean?
I think if there was one thing that I would say you really have to have, it's going to be reality and data-driven awareness of what's going on. And that needs to be hindcasting as well as forecasting. You know, the BRC plays a long game. They started penetrating our academic sector, well, the global academic sector, back in the 90s. You know, that they've subverted many of our engines. They are a predator, but we have to look at what the realities are, not just the narratives of, oh, we need to do, you know, more icebreakers. The Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, has never justified more than 5 icebreakers. Not saying we don't need them. We absolutely do. But let's base the decision-making on hard data, on reality. Let's look at things from a system science approach. All of the interconnections, what's really going on, what really will help.
Matt?
I would say very simple. We need an integrated Arctic investment strategy. So take the goal, we talked about this. Our goal is to bridge the gap between national defense requirements and then local community priorities. So success for us will be like aligning these 2 pillars. Because if we align, you know, what does the defense requirements are with what are the needs of the local community priorities, then we can create what private sector wants, which is long-term predictable framework conditions. You know, if right now it seems like there's not a big master plan for where the investments will go. So we need that in place. We need a little bit of coordination, and then, you know, then I'm sure we will succeed. So give me a long-term comprehensive Arctic investment plan for total defense.
And Alec?
Giving me the last word, that's dangerous. I think following through is my big concern. You know, if you look at the cycles that Canadian interest in the Arctic has gone through, there's many of them. I mean, in the 1980s, we were talking about building the icebreakers that we're only now building today, that are still not going to be in the water for 4 years. You know, we talked about submarine fleets. We did all those things, and you know, it was eventually fell the wayside because of other you know, priorities. I think this has been the constant demon in Canadian Arctic policy, and you know, certainly the government is saying a lot of the right things now. I think it's more incumbent, and we have more capability in Canada than ever to follow through. But that takes some political focus, and I think Canadians need to be putting pressure on their political leaders to cooperate on this, because it's not a partisan issue.
Well, I agree with you. I think maintaining a focus on Arctic security is the only way that those resources and mobilizations are going to happen. It's a theme that we're going to come back to more than once on Security Disruptors. And I want to thank you, our panel, for joining us today, giving us all of your valuable insights into where we're at, where we need to go, and the momentum that we need to maintain. And also to all of you who joined us online, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Security Disruptors.